Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second fireside chat with Tech Goes Home, sponsored by Google. My name is Marvin Venay, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief Advocacy Officer for Tech Goes Home. And tonight we are going to have an exciting conversation. But let me tell you a little bit about who Tech Goes Home is. Tech Goes Home's mission is to empower communities to access and use digital tools to overcome barriers in their lives. We provide a computer because we believe equipment is essential. And then we're also providing digital training because we believe education is important. And lastly, we're providing internet access for a year because we believe in order for you to be able to transfer your life from being on the outside to the inside, you have to have access, and that is through the internet. One of the most important things about that is that it's no cost to any of our learners. So we're removing barriers because we truly want to make sure that people are able to be a part of the solution and not on the outside of the problem. Thank you again for joining us. Tonight I want to tell you that we are very fortunate to service those who are ages 3 to 96. But tonight particularly I want to speak to all of those who are our learners and let you know that we have an exciting and prolific vanguard of people with us tonight. And one in particular we have seated next to me as our state representative from Haverhill, Mr. Andy X. Vargas. I'll give you a little background on this gentleman. He is from the Dominican Republic. His family moved to Cambridge and then landed in Haverhill. He went to Haverhill Public Schools. He went on to Boston University. He was a member of the city council here in Haverhill. And then he also went on to become a state representative. He is seated as the vice chair of the Economic Development and Emerging Technologies Committee. He also sits on Ways and Means. He sits on the Education, the Public Health, and the Redistricting. And he is a member of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus, my former home. And so I just want to say that we are excited to have you with us tonight, Rep. Vargas.
Thank you, Marvin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
25% of the population here in Haverhill is made up of Dominicans, if I believe correct.
Latinos. Yeah.
Latino,
yeah.
Latinx. Yeah. Thank you. And as we know, digital equity is a huge disparity that exists in not just this community, but in multiple communities throughout the Commonwealth. What does digital equity mean to you as a state rep, but also as someone who has faced some of the challenges that many of those who are on the outside of this digital divide have faced at one point? What does it mean to you today?
Yeah, well, first I just want to say thank you to Tech Goes Home for actually coming to Haverhill and doing this event here and Make It Haverhill, and a huge shout out to Make It Haverhill for all the work that you do in community, in neighborhoods. I think it's so important to have a physical presence as well as, of course, our digital and virtual presence. Digital equity to me really means three things, right? It's access, it's affordability, and it's literacy. Right? Okay. Those are the three pillars that I think about when I think about digital equity. And it's so important for us to address each of those pillars in a variety of different ways. And one of the best ways to address that last pillar around literacy is the work that's done with Tech Goes Home and Make It Haverhill, having physical presence with constituents that need some more hands-on support on that literacy end of things. One of the things that really surprised me when my wife was going through her master's program at BC in education was, I remember reading over one of her papers. I was proofreading it. She'll never give me credit for it. And
that's how it goes.
That's how it goes. Her paper was about looking at where the greatest disparities were among low-income students and higher-income students at Haverhill High. Okay. And you might think it was English or social studies or math. It was computer science, right, where the greatest disparity was between students. Okay. And that sort of stayed with me forever because I knew that similarly to reading being essential to be able to learn everything else after that, sure, we have to start looking at digital literacy and computer science as being essential to learning that comes after that as well. And so that's what I think about when the term digital equity comes up.
Seeing and hearing that, my assumption is that you have instituted, probably at the city level or even at the state level, something in regards to computer science in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, there are computer science classes, and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has their own sort of set curriculum for computer science, but obviously it's not working right now, right? Or at least before the pandemic, we were seeing that the gaps were pretty wide there. And so we've got to take a look at not only what's happening outside of our schools and the work that we do in neighborhood, but how do we revamp the K through 12 curriculum to really make sure that students are learning there while they're in school.
Right, because we have to teach them from the bottom up so that they can actually see where the value is early on.
Correct.
Right, okay. How do you see digital inequity play out in communities that you represent particularly?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, we spent a lot of time talking about access, right? How do we get actual connectivity into homes? And I think for the most part, we're doing a pretty solid job of that. I think the bigger problem, particularly in Haverhill, in our district, is affordability, right? And affordability is being addressed in a variety of governmental programs and great nonprofit programs like Tech Goes Home. But I think we have to look at the overarching systemic problem, which is that we don't have competition when it comes to internet service providers. Right?
So it's a monopoly here.
There's a monopoly, right? There's one service provider in Haverhill, and that goes for the majority of the state. The majority of the state only has one internet service provider. And so when you think about that, that creates the conditions where consumers have to pay whatever the internet service provider says, right? Because where else are you going to go, right? You can go back to DSL if you want, but if not, you got to pay what it is, right? And so that's why, during the pandemic, it was really frustrating when we saw, some companies bring back data caps, right? And try to say that because, homes were using a certain amount of data above a certain amount, that they were going to start surcharging residents. When there's no engineering reason to actually charge that, right? When you actually think about, is there more of a cost on service providers for providing more data? The answer is no, right? When you talk to any engineers on that, they'll tell you no. And so one of the big things that we had to do during the pandemic was fight back on that, right? And tell the stories of our constituents about how they were working from home. They had 3 kids at home. The kids were also playing more video games, so the bandwidth was greater. And so many people were going to be subject to the surcharge. And it was through the collective organizing through our constituents, but also my colleagues across the state, that we were able to prevent those data caps from going into effect. And so they never actually went into effect here in Massachusetts, thankfully. And we're hoping that that stays permanent.
What piece of legislation was that?
So that was actually first just a letter that we sent, right? And I got together with about 40 of my colleagues, bipartisan, and I said, hey, are you guys hearing from your constituents on this? And they said, actually, yeah, we are. So sign me on to that letter and let's send it over. And then, once we heard back that our letter wasn't going to change the policy, we said, all right, well, we'll file legislation then. And so we filed legislation to mandate that there weren't going to be surcharges or data caps, particularly during a state of emergency. We felt that we were on the strongest legal ground by filing that legislation. And shortly after filing that, we were able to get the companies to commit to not implementing their data cap.
Which brings me to a question about, as you discussed, the pandemic created a lot of tension, right? Particularly for you all as policymakers, because you had to make some wide-ranging decisions. As it relates to digital equity, how do you think we can create some more sustainable changes at the state level so that we're not kind of piecemealing this thing, but we're actually making transformational shifts? Because what I hear you say is like, the data cap was one area that we were able to regulate during this period of time. But the pandemic is closing out, right? Those resources or those regulations might be, pending change. But what do we do to create more sustainability?
Yeah, part of the challenge is that this is an issue that is probably candidly best regulated at the federal level. And so it's really hard for us to make the argument at the state level, because what we hear is it's tough to have a hodgepodge of different telecommunications legislation in one state versus another state. And so it makes it really difficult for us to make the case to really set up a regulatory framework here. But that being said, we still have our duty to respond to the needs of our constituents. And so we're looking at, are there different ways for us to incentivize more competition when it comes to ISPs? So how do we make it easier for a new internet service provider or a startup that wants to provide an alternative for folks in communities to be able to have access to either the roads to lay the fiber, or incentives to be able to actually start working with 5G and small cell technology that can help create some options, some competition, so that people aren't forced to just pay one provider because that's all that's there. And so I think we have to look at it from a systemic level. We have to continue to support all the work that's being done in community while we figure out the systems level questions. But I think the overarching sort of theme is that we have to start treating the internet as essential as our other utilities,
Correct.
right? As water, as electricity,
Yeah.
as gas, et cetera.
Yeah.
It's just as essential. And when you think about the things that those utilities power, right? Your water coming out of your sink, your refrigerator, your stove, et cetera. We have to work together with the partners that are providing the technology that is powered by the internet. And so that's why we really also have to partner with the private sector. This isn't something that government can fix alone.
You bring a good point around relationships, right? Because all of this work is about how you build the relationship and how that relationship can then evolve towards something of change. Because it's not who you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know,
Yep.
right? Let me switch gears a bit. Let's think about this from a fun lens. How would you teach?
This is all fun to me.
Yeah, no. That's good because I think of it the same. So,
Yeah.
but how would you teach a young person, and I'm talking about somebody in high school, a fun way of becoming an advocate for digital equity?
Yeah, and just real quick to your last point around relationships, I think it's so crucial for us to be able to advocate for those long-term systems issues while still being able to partner with people we disagree with.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one way that this issue can really bring people together in a time where there's so much partisanship, there's so much divisiveness.
Right.
And so even with the internet service provider that I was mentioning, we were still able to work with them to make sure that people in our district were able to get their service for a discounted rate.
Right.
We were still talking to them and communicating with them. And so I think it's a good example of how broadband should be a nonpartisan issue that brings us all together, regardless of when we might disagree.
Right.
To your question around how do we get young people kind of excited about this stuff, it's funny because it's kind of similar to how I think about how we get young people excited about politics, right? I always tell them that you think that politics is out there and it's for somebody else, right? It's not for me.
That's typically how it is, right? That's what we grew up as.
Right. But the way I explain it is politics is everywhere, right? You turn on the water and the water comes out clean, that's politics.
Yeah.
Your school is underfunded, that's politics. You have a pothole on the road, that's politics, right? And broadband digital equity is similar in that nature, right? You go to school, technology is super important. The job that you want to have, technology is going to be incredibly important. You want to network online, technology incredibly important. And so when we think about computer literacy skills, it's such an essential function for our students to learn. And so framing it from that perspective and then finding particular areas of interest. So for example, gaming, right?
Yeah.
A lot of kids are interested in gaming,
excitement
right?
around that.
So how do we tell them, have you ever thought about how this game was created, right? Have you ever thought about the code that's behind this? Would you ever want to create your own game? And sort of finding a way through there to get kids excited about learning computer science.
How do you feel like your constituents are coming to you in regards to their being disconnected? Do you feel like that's an issue that people are coming to you directly for, or there's just something you're aware of based upon studies or what have you?
No, we're definitely hearing it, right? And it's sort of two-pronged. The main thing is affordability, right? We just hear, that they don't have any other options. Their initial contract that was $30 a month is up, and now they're going up to $150 a month. And they're balancing that with increased housing costs, food costs, everything else that's increasing right now. It makes it incredibly challenging. But the other end that we do hear about, and that we might not hear about directly, but we learn about indirectly, is how many people don't even have email, for example, right? We have constituents that call our office looking for help, and we have a constituent services intake form, right? That's online, and we use it to ensure that we have the authorization of my constituents to go advocate on their behalf. Some of them can't fill it out themselves, right? And so Sasha, who's here from my office, spends a lot of time on the phone filling things out and working things for constituents that actually don't have either the technology or the digital literacy skills to be able to advocate for themselves. And then secondly, even I'm a realtor on the side, and I just experienced this last week. I have a buyer, first-time home buyer, that didn't have a scanner at home and didn't have an email, right? And was well qualified to be able to get her pre-approval, but she didn't have a place to scan her documents, right? And she went to the bodega, and the bodega was saying that it was going to be $1 a page to be able to scan and make copies. I had to go and make the copies for her myself. And so there's so many different ways that the lack of digital literacy and the lack of the technology affects everyday life, from housing to getting the services that you need to telehealth and healthcare.
Right. How do we make this a bigger issue on the Hill? And for those who are watching, Beacon Hill is what I'm referencing, the State House.
Yeah.
What, how do we make it a bigger issue there?
Well, I think we have to continue to tell the stories of real people that are experiencing this, right? I think there's perhaps a misunderstanding that, Massachusetts is not like one of the states that still, has less than half or, 75% of the state connected to broadband. But we have a severe affordability problem.
Yeah.
And we have to start telling that story. And we have to also start telling the story of how computer science is directly tied to the economic growth of our state, right? If we want to be able to compete, if we want to be able to have a workforce that can fill the jobs that are available, if we want companies to continue to come to Massachusetts and view it as a place that has a workforce that is ready to take on their projects, then it's essential that we make this a top priority.
We're a nonprofit that is raising capital like everyone else, right? That's our daily work, right? We're providing programming, we're raising capital to support the programming, we're advocating to ensure that resources are tagged and added. But how do we become a stronger partner with you and your colleagues around this work? I know you're talking about it from the lens of, how people can come into the State House and advocate, but how do we become a stronger partner in coalitions that we're a part of, like the Essex County Community Fund and the Latinos for Education and those folks? How do we galvanize and become a larger entity and a voice there for you?
It's building those coalitions, right? And coming to the State House with the voices of the people most impacted, right? I think Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley probably puts it best, right? The people closest to the pain have to be closest to the power.
Right.
And so I always say that it's wonderful when advocates come to the State House, but it's even better when they bring the people that they're advocating for so that they can speak for themselves.
Okay.
I think a lot of times we like to say, we're a voice for the voiceless. Yeah. But the voiceless have voices, right? And it's how do we actually bring them to the table so that they can tell their stories. As a legislator, I can tell you that there's nothing more impactful than me hearing from a constituent, somebody that lives in my district, that tells me this is what I'm going through on a day-to-day basis. That creates a sense of urgency. And when you can back that up with numbers, with lots of constituents that are feeling that, I think that creates a real political and social capital to advance your issues.
Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We are with Representative Andy Vargas from the 3rd Essex County, area here in Haverhill, Massachusetts, as the state representative. And we are closing out this segment. We will bring back a panelist shortly. We thank you for tuning in and hope that you continue with the conversation.